Gudrun, Edda, Albert, Rolf, and the others. Children of Himmler, Göring, Speer, and Mengele. They are remembered as the children of silence, daughters and sons of the criminals responsible for the darkest hours of contemporary history. But that history is not their own story. Their parents committed absolute evil and unabashedly abdicated all humanity by unanimously declaring themselves innocent of the charges brought against them at the Nuremberg trials. What happened to these children of the monsters of World War II? Their common legacy is the extermination of millions of innocents by their parents. Their names are forever marked with the stain of infamy. Do they have to feel responsible, and even guilty, for the acts committed by their parents? When an inheritance is so sinister, it cannot fail to influence, even though it is generally accepted that children should not be considered responsible for their parents' guilt. But what about that popular saying that, like father, like son, which undoubtedly gives much to think about? Nevertheless, we will delve into the lives of each of these heirs of evil to see how their lives were during Nazi Germany and what became of their lives after World War II. The puppy of the Nazis, that is how Gudrun Himmler was known. In 1958, in a small town in the Bohemian Forest, Austria, nostalgic individuals of the Third Reich from all over Europe tend to arrive. In the rural setting of an ancient Celtic sacred site, some elegantly dressed older men gather with their former comrades. Young neo-Nazis also join the meeting to meet the veterans. In that small assembly, composed of former Nazis and personalities close to the extreme right, all consider that the members of the Waffen-SS did nothing but fulfill their duty as citizens. They praise their sense of sacrifice and sometimes even consider them victims. Some proudly display their German military decorations from World War II, the Iron Cross, or the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, which features a swastika in the center of the insignia. They enthusiastically reminisce about the time of the superiority of the German people, the national community that demanded total self-sacrifice, unwavering loyalty. Among all these movements, someone moves in the crowd at that paradisiacal place. It is an honored guest who remains apart, preferring to receive small groups, surrounded by her court. Only a few privileged are invited to parade in front of her. Her glasses hide small eyes of glacial blue that terrify her interlocutors. They idolize her because she is an exceptional heiress of great Germany, the princess of Nazism, Gudrun Himmler. The princess likes to see her supporters parade in front of her and ask them in an inquisitorial tone, "Where were you during the war?" Or, "In which unit did you fight?" Her father taught her military logistics, and she observed everything when she accompanied him on his inspection tours. The former combatants who parade are proud to be presented before the daughter of Hitler's best executor. 5th SS Viking Armored Division, replies the man who has just entered the small hall, intimidated. She continues her interrogation. Volunteer in the Danish Waffen-SS? Absolutely, responds the ex-combatant. Undoubtedly, she inherited her father's talents, and she was also his only legitimate daughter, and she was always there to repay her father the honor of being his daughter. She was always convinced of her innocence, believing that he did not commit the crimes he was accused of, and considers his conviction to be a total injustice. For a long time, she wanted to write a book aimed at rehabilitating him and not defending him, as this would be equivalent to acknowledging his guilt. Gudrun always believed that someday he would be named like we talk about Napoleon, Wellington, or Moltke today. But history has definitively condemned him for his crimes. On Wednesday afternoons, her father used to take her with him to perform his inspections, especially at Dachau. Germany's first concentration camp opened in March 1933, which he himself had created and was located a few kilometers from Munich. Those with a red triangle are prisoners. Those with a black triangle are criminals, he explained. For the girl, they all looked like poorly dressed and unshaven prisoners. At the Dachau concentration camp, there lived more than 12,000 human beings deprived of their freedom instead of the original 5,000 prisoners for which it had been built. They came from the most diverse nations. Not all had arrived at Dachau as opponents of National Socialism or for opposing its policies. In addition to political prisoners, there were people interned simply for belonging to certain human categories: Jews, Scholars in biblical subjects, gypsies, vagrants, homosexuals, and primarily criminals who, once they had served their sentence, were transferred by the Gestapo to the concentration camp. Since late 1942, Dachau acquired a characteristic that distinguished it from other Nazi concentration camps. The Gestapo began also interning their priests imprisoned unlawfully and against all laws. Surely the little puppy was able to witness some of these acts in Dachau, such as when the SS arranged the reception at the station of all prisoners before entering the pre-trial prison camp, so that there was no doubt about the fate that awaited them. Like savages, the guards mistreated the prisoners descending from the freight car, still emaciated from the train journey and not surprisingly also hungry. They yelled at them, insulted them, slapped them. From the first moment, they had to instill in these defenseless victims that from now on they would have no rights. However, Puppy, as her father affectionately called her, was more interested in the vegetable garden and the greenhouse. My father explained to me the importance of the plants they cultivated there, and I was able to pluck some leaves, she recalls. She was 12 years old when they made that macabre visit. The garden reminded her of her childhood on the farm, where she liked to help her mother in the garden. A photo immortalized that visit to Dachau. A blonde girl wearing a black coat smiles. She seems happy, surrounded by her father, Reinhard Heydrich, future director of the Gestapo, and Karl Wolff, Himmler's adjutant, standing under a sign indicating the prisoners' concentration area. Gudrun followed her father's rise with admiration. In August 1943, she wrote in her diary, "Daddy, Minister of the Interior of the Reich, I am crazy with joy." What a prestigious father. In a letter sent in July 1942, while heading to the extermination camp of Auschwitz to oversee the implementation of the final solution through the large-scale use of Zyklon B gas, Himmler wrote to his wife, with the greatest detachment, "I am leaving for Auschwitz, a kiss." In his letters, he never gave details about his trips or his activities, not a word about the extermination of the Jewish populations. He simply wrote that he had a lot of work and heavy tasks to fulfill. Later, the same man calmly justified his atrocities. "I did not feel I had the right to leave Jewish women and children alive, to let those children grow up to become the avengers who would later kill our sons and grandsons. That would have seemed like cowardice to me. Therefore, the matter was resolved clearly." But history is not the story of the daughter of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, the undisputed master and fanatic of the Third Reich's repressive apparatus. In her childhood, Heinrich Himmler's companions said he was incapable of killing a fly. When he became an adult, he became the key man of the Gestapo and the SS, at the center of the implementation of the concentration camps and the extermination of the Jews of Europe. On August 8, 1929, Gudrun was born, a girl with blue eyes weighing 3.625 kilograms and measuring 54 centimeters. She would be the only legitimate daughter of Heinrich Himmler, his puppy, his little doll. The name Gudrun referred to the book Himmler had read and adored in his youth, the Saga of Gudrun. It was a praise of the virtue of the Nordic woman for which a man was willing to die. Since Marga could not have more children, the couple later adopted a boy, the son of a dead SS soldier, but who did not find the love of a family in that home. In her diary, Marga wrote that the little boy was of criminal nature, a liar, and a thief. Later, he was sent to a boarding school and then to a Napola, a school intended to train the Reich's elite. Gudrun, for her part, perfectly fulfilled her role as a model girl, and her mother repeated in her diary that she was affectionate and gentle. In 1940, Himmler separated from Marga, but out of respect for his daughter's mother, decided not to divorce. He then tried to stay as close as possible to his daughter, whom he adored and loved above all else. Despite his increasing political activity and his countless trips, he wanted to continue being a good father and a worthy husband. In many photos of her childhood in which she appeared next to her traveling dad, as she used to call him, Puppy was a perfect German, with an angelic face, blonde, dressed in Bavarian clothes, with braids and sometimes with a bow. Her father used to tell her what he did daily, sent her photos, and spent all the time he could with her. Reading Heinrich Himmler's agenda reveals almost daily phone communications with his wife and daughter. Himmler wrote everything down. His notebook was full of surprising comments, such as "played with the children" or "conversation with puppy." On the other hand, the Führer played a central role in Gudrun's childhood. In 1935, 2 years after assuming his functions, one night when little Gudrun couldn't fall asleep, she asked her mother, distressed, "Does Uncle Hitler also have to die?" When her mother reassured her, saying that the Führer would live at least 100 years, Gudrun replied with relief, "No, Mum, I know he will live 200 years. The Himmlers felt happy and flattered by the attention the Führer gave to their daughter. On May 3, 1938, Marga Himmler wrote in her diary, "The Führer came. Puppy was very enthusiastic. It was wonderful to share the table with him, among friends." Every New Year's, Gudrun visited the Führer, and he gave her a doll and a box of chocolates. In her interrogation at Nuremberg on September 22, 1945, she explained that, "During the war, we never traveled. We lived 5 years in that house and I went to school. That's all I did." Indeed, Himmler did not allow Gudrun to move to Berlin with her mother. She was afraid of air raids, which were intensifying. Poppy lived in the constant expectation of her parents' return and, above all, of her father's brief and sporadic visits. She often suffered from stomach pains. She was a nervous girl and her school grades were getting worse. But she continued to follow the conflict's evolution with interest. She feared for her father. In her diary, her mother wrote that little Gudrun understood many things she shouldn't know. In contrast, her father wanted her mother to explain the situation, even though little Gudrun was not old enough to understand it. On Sunday, June 22, 1941, the day Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, which marked the opening of a front in the east, Gudrun, who was then 12 years old, wrote to her father, "It's awful that we're waging war against Russia. They were our allies. Russia is so big. If we take all of Russia, the fighting will be very difficult." Apparently, Gudrun had heard about the Nazi delusion of a Germanic space that would reach the Urals, shared among the Reich's men. On the other hand, another heir to her father's surname was the little princess of Nero of Nazi Germany, referring to the daughter of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. Edda Göring was born on June 2, 1938. Her mother, Emmy Sonnemann, the second wife of the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, was an actress of the Weimar National Theatre. Her parents had met in 1932 in Weimar, where Hermann Göring had gone with Adolf Hitler. Their wedding in 1935 was as grand as the coronation of an emperor. Hermann Göring loved luxury and opulence above all. To celebrate the birth of their daughter, Mrs. Göring ordered that 500 Luftwaffe planes fly over Berlin, which was under her command. If they had had a male child, they would have flown 1,000 planes over Berlin. Edda's father was a hero of World War I, an experienced fighter pilot with many decorations, including the highest German military distinction, the Pour le Mérite Cross. After the death of the Red Baron, the famous pilot Manfred von Richthofen, and then of Wilhelm Reinhard, Göring took his place and became the head of the famous fighter squadron known as the Flying Circus. Göring was by Adolf Hitler's side from the very beginning. Nothing attracted him more than the privileges of power. He was one of the creators of the Gestapo, the state's secret police, and of the first concentration camps, including Oranienburg, near Berlin. Edda grew up in that sumptuous residence surrounded by an immense park and thousands of hectares of forests, a nature reserve populated by bison, buffalo, deer, moose, and wild horses. Karen Hall was full of artwork stolen by Göring in his insatiable hunt for treasures. He liked to call himself the Third Reich's patron. In the basement of the residence there was a cinema room, a gym, an indoor pool, a game room, and a Russian steam bath. Göring had also ordered the installation of medical offices and a bunker. Edda lived her early years in that luxury, accompanied by loving and attentive parents. Nothing was too much for the little princess. A governess took charge of her education. She lived isolated from the world and did not know any of the hardships caused by the war, as her mother recounted in her biography. To distract little Edda, the Luftwaffe, of which Hermann Göring was commander-in-chief, gave her a miniature replica of the Potsdam Palace of King Frederick the Great of Prussia. That dollhouse had kitchens, living rooms, and scaled characters, as well as a theatre with a stage and real backdrops. Edda grew up among historical figures whose actions would have more or less honourable historical repercussions. Herbert Hoover, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, aviator Charles Lindbergh, but also Benito Mussolini, the kings of Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, and airplane manufacturers Willy Messerschmitt and Ernst Heinkel, among others. But that life away from the war and its atrocities ended on January 31st, 1945, when Edda and her mother were forced to leave for Obersalzberg, Bavaria, near the Austrian border, to shelter from the Russian troops. When the girl left Karinhol, the door was definitively closed on her 7 years of life as a princess. Knowing that the Red Army troops were approaching, Hermann Göring ordered his property to be dynamited. The demolition was entrusted to a Luftwaffe team, but before that, Göring had secured his private art collection in Berchtesgaden. More than 200 million Reichsmarks in artworks left Karinhol. Later, the press of the time spoke of the star prisoner of Straubing, Emmy Göring, who had already lost her pride and had to wash her own underwear. She had no right to any communication with the outside and lacked news of her husband. Regarding Straubing, her daughter Edda would later declare, "Actually, it seems to me we weren't so bad there. I slept in my mother's cell on a mattress covered by a checkered blanket that they said Mussolini had given her." Emmy and her daughter were released in February 1946, penniless and with nowhere to go. The former First Lady of the Reich then asked the prison director to allow them to stay a few more days. A little later, Margaret and Gudrun Himmler would be in the same situation. On May 29, 1947, like all the wives of the convicted Nazi dignitaries in Nuremberg, Emmy, accused of having profited from the Nazi regime, was arrested in her house in Sackdilling. As she suffered from sciatica, she was moved by ambulance. Despite her mother's reassuring words, little Edda, who was 9 years old, thought that her mother could also be sentenced to death. Then, Göring's wife was locked up in an old camp for Russian female workers in Goggingen near Augsburg. Although more than 1,000 women were incarcerated there, in 5 barracks, Emmy Göring, as Hermann Göring's wife, believed she was entitled to special treatment. But that was not the case. For Christmas, Edda was able to spend 2 days with her mother. Later, she was allowed to visit her once a month. On July 20th, 1948, during her denazification process, Emmy was accused by prosecutor Julius Herf, in charge of special affairs in Bavaria, who considered her a first-category suspect. Although she always presented herself as apolitical, Emmy admitted to having always felt ideologically connected to Göring as his wife. She also declared that she never knew anything about the concentration and extermination camps and defended herself against accusations regarding the ostentatious luxury in which she had lived. Emmy Göring justified everything by the love she felt for her husband. "I always considered love to be a grace. I didn't know that one could be punished for it." But the prosecutor reminded her that she had once attended a performance at the Vienna State Opera wearing a white ermine coat and valuable jewelry, causing a scandal among the audience. Nevertheless, for Edda, as for Gudrun Himmler, the only one responsible for everything was Hitler. Göring remains to his daughter a magnificent father. "My father was not a fanatic. You could read peace in his eyes. I loved him very much, and it was clear that he loved me." She always upheld her surname, which she uses with pride. She believes that in reality it gives her advantages, especially in her travels, because knowing her surname leads to introductions to important local personalities. "When they find out I am Göring's daughter, waiters don't let me pay the bill. Taxi drivers don't charge me for the ride," she says with a certain arrogance. Although there are disturbing similarities between Himmler's daughter, the reserved bureaucrat, initiator of the final solution, and Göring's daughter, the Nero of Nazism. Both continued to adore their parents, denied their crimes, and lived or are living post-war in Munich, in museum houses consecrated to paternal glory. Another common point: like Edda, Gudrun Himmler always avoided any contact with journalists. A prominent reporter from Le Monde recounted her attempts to interview Göring's daughter in the 90s. She answered the phone firmly, "This is Edda Göring speaking." When she learned the purpose of the call, which was an investigation into the memory of the Shoah, Edda responded decisively, "I do not give interviews." However, she found it important to clarify, "I never had problems with my surname. On the contrary, it is a source of pride. My father remains popular in Germany. The media don't like to say it, but they don't reflect public opinion. The Bavarian government has made my mother and me suffer, but the people have always supported us." She spoke with a pull, with passion, anger, resentment. Perhaps she thought she had said too much. "No interviews," she repeated. To conclude, only one sentence, just one. "I love my father very much. That's all they can write." Like in the Himmler family, it was Göring's great-niece and his brother who rejected that terrible past. At 30 years old, both decided to have themselves sterilized to interrupt the lineage and not be another Göring, another monster. Bettina Göring, who lives withdrawn from the world without water or electricity in New Mexico, United States, believes she resembles that great uncle much more than her own daughter. When she talks about Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal, she asserts that the man was so terrifying that beside him all family members, although they were also fervent Nazis, seemed insignificant. At 11 years old, while Bettina was watching a documentary about concentration camps with her grandmother, the latter corrected her. "They are pure lies." In the Göring family, as in many other German families, the easiest thing was to deny any personal involvement. There was no reprehensible action, not even on Hermann Göring's part. As for Matthias Göring, great-nephew of Hermann Göring, he converted to Judaism. At 40 years old, he decided to wear a kippah and a Star of David, eat kosher, and celebrate the Sabbath. In the early 21st century, after his physiotherapy practice went bankrupt, his wife left him, desperate, and he was on the verge of suicide. He prayed for God to come to his aid and believed he had received signs leading him to the Holy Land. He decided to go to Israel and join the community of the victims. Definitely, when we study the different cases of the children of Nazi dignitaries, we realize that it is very difficult for the children to judge their parents. They lack objectivity towards those who brought them into the world and educated them. The closer the emotional proximity, the more complicated the judgment. The positions adopted by the children of those Nazi dignitaries were, in some cases, diametrically opposed and, in others, similar to those of their parents. Few of them were neutral. Some managed to firmly reject their parents' actions, even though they continued to love them. Others could not love a monster and denied that dark side to preserve unconditional filial love. Lastly, some have fallen into hatred and rejection. They inherited that past as a cross they must carry daily. Some did not renounce anything. Others took the path of spirituality. Some even chose to be sterilized, as mentioned, to avoid transmitting that heritage, or thought to atone through acts of masturbation, denial, rejection, or feelings of guilt, consciously or not. All had to choose their own way to face their past. Most children of Nazi dignitaries did not change their surnames, even though they found them bothersome. Some, like the children of Albert Speer or Martin Bormann, have the same first name as their parents. Matthias Göring, great-nephew of Hermann Göring, says he likes his surname. Others maintain that the surname they inherited is not important. Eichmann's son said, "Running away from that surname wouldn't have changed anything. One cannot escape their past." As for Gudrun Himmler and Edda Göring, as we have seen, they are proud of their patronymic and venerate their parents. On one occasion, Auschwitz extermination camp commander Rudolf Höss declared, "Even when I applied extermination measures, I led a normal family life. It was sacred to me. Indissoluble bonds connect me to it." How can this be understood? How can we explain that the executors were able to massacre millions of people while simultaneously leading a normal family life? How could monsters kiss their children before leaving their homes to kill or order the killing of men, women, and children without any remorse? How could Himmler kiss his daughter and then go out to sign executions of children just for being Jewish? One of Ribbentrop's sons, Adolf Hitler's foreign minister, said bluntly, "My father only did what he believed was right. If we were in the same circumstances, I would make the same decisions as him. He was just one of Hitler's advisors, although in reality, Hitler did not take advice from anyone. All my father wanted was to fulfill his duty as a German. He foresaw the immense danger coming from the East. History proved him right." Like him, throughout his life, Gudrun Himmler considered her father, Heinrich Himmler, to have been innocent. The latter would have said exactly that at the Nuremberg trial if he had not committed suicide beforehand. In many cases, each of the children of Nazi monsters took their past based on their own childhood. Some felt that their need for love had been fulfilled, especially the males, but also only daughters, like Gudrun Himmler, Heinrich Himmler's only legitimate daughter, Edda Göring, Reichsmarschall's daughter, or Irina Rosenberg, daughter of the Third Reich theorist and Minister of Occupied Russian Territories, Alfred Rosenberg. The three pampered daughters continued to sympathize with Nazism. One question that arises in this analysis is what the 6 children of Joseph Goebbels would have said if their mother, Magda Goebbels, had not murdered them with cyanide in the bunker. This would be a topic for analysis in another video, examining how these 6 children died at the hands of their own mother. On the other hand, some of Albert Speer's children, the Minister of Armaments and War Production under Hitler, say they have repressed all their memories associated with Adolf Hitler. They do not want to admit that close contact with a man whom Hilde Speer, their father's favorite, says she disdains. She refuses to remember him, despite having appreciated him during her childhood. Many photos show her holding the Führer's hand, with her little white skirt and flowers in her hair. She does not remember him, or does not want to remember him. Denial or the decision to move forward. It is impossible to say. Currently, Hilde Speer, like her siblings, refuses to talk about their father. When Albert Speer was within the Third Reich, she was very young. When the war ended, she was 9 years old, and less than a year later her father was imprisoned. Like Albert Jr. and his other brothers and sisters, she understood from a very young age that, to survive, she had to say she was not guilty and dissociate herself from her father's actions. Currently, she is a woman who constantly refuses to be linked to that uncomfortable progenitor. Other children of Nazis had the opportunity to confront their father, and this was the case of Josef Mengele's son. On his father's recommendation, Rolf Mengele took the precaution of traveling to São Paulo anonymously, using the passport he had stolen from a friend while they were vacationing together. Determined to see his father in São Paulo, he maintained that his father was no longer the hero he had been to him in his youth. He believed he had nothing in common with his father. On the contrary, my opinions are diametrically opposed. Until the end of his miserable life, Mengele never let his guard down. At the antipodes of the cold and calculating man who reigned in Auschwitz concentration camp, he had become, in those years of hiding, a man consumed by fear. He obsessively feared being found and captured. That fear was stronger than anything else. It devoured him. His anguish was revealed by constantly sucking and swallowing the hairs of his mustache. These hairs formed balls in his intestines that blocked his digestive tracts and hurt him terribly, even endangering his life. That day, Rolf Mengele was his father's hero. He had taken many risks to see the man who had never deigned to take care of him. In his tender childhood, his father was too busy committing the worst atrocities, and then, in his youth, fleeing the Allies and Nazi hunters. Mengele had devoted little time to that son. Only letters allowed them to maintain an appearance of a bond. The boy, who for a long time was considered by the Mengele dynasty as the black sheep of the family, was now an established lawyer in Freiburg, Germany. Perceived by his own family as just another leftist, he always thought he had nothing in common with his family except for blood, through the most hated man in the world, his father. When he made that trip, Rolf was 33 years old, the same age his father was when he was a doctor in Auschwitz, deciding the life or death of thousands of people with a simple hand gesture. No survivor could forget that elegant man, with the whip in hand, who, dressed in his impeccable uniform and perfectly polished boots, simply pointed with his finger at those he had chosen as subjects for his experiments. To the right, life and his laboratory. To the left, death. His face showed no emotion when he sent men, women, children and babies to the gas chambers or to his dark experiments. Undoubtedly, his father was at the center of the death machinery. Rolf managed to articulate a weak, "Good afternoon, father." They shared a brief and cold hug. Neither of them was accustomed to showing their feelings. Rolf forced himself to be cordial, but only succeeded when he saw tears running down the old man's cheeks. There is no doubt that, knowing his father's trajectory, this would not have happened to Rolf. Finally, he knew the man who, at the end of May 1943, after being named SS Hauptsturmführer, was assigned to Auschwitz, the largest concentration camp created by the Nazis, 67 kilometers west of Krakow, near the Czechoslovak border. At that time, Auschwitz was an implacable industrial extermination machinery. Smoke continuously emanated from the 4 large complexes of gas chambers and crematoria. There, the air was unbreathable, and the smell of burning flesh was even more unbearable when it was hot. The concentration camp was immense, consisting of 3 large sections that continued to grow over the years. At Auschwitz, trains arrived incessantly from all over Europe. The newly arrived were subjected to a preliminary selection. On one hand, those deemed fit for forced labor, and on the other, those sent directly to the gas chambers, disguised as showers. In each group arriving at the ramp, Mengele looked for twins to subject them to the most sinister experiments, which almost always led to death amid atrocious suffering. He was convinced that, thanks to his experiments on twins, he could eradicate defective genes. His face lit up when twins were presented for selection, and someone would shout loudly, "Twins! Twins!" His experiments were countless and were carried out without anesthesia, blood manipulations, inoculation of infectious genes, spinal cord experiments, organ or limb ablation, sterilization. Joseph Mengele was also interested in eye color to determine if it could be altered. For this purpose, he injected chemicals that caused blindness in his poor victims. The São Paulo residence was modest. Mengele decided to sleep on the floor and leave his bed to Rolf. Anyway, the nights were essentially used for discussion. Rolf was eager for answers. At first, he avoided addressing his father's participation in the atrocities committed in Auschwitz, but then he interrogated him. Mengele became defensive. "How can you believe I committed such things? Don't you see it's a lie? That it's propaganda?" The old man defended himself vehemently. "I didn't invent Auschwitz, and I'm not personally responsible for the incidents that occurred there. Auschwitz existed before me. I wanted to help, but I was very limited. I couldn't help everyone." But the most surprising thing for his son was that Mengele did not feel even a hint of remorse for the atrocities committed in Auschwitz. The conversation with his father concluded, and Rolf returned to Europe once again.